here for you this evening, but first of all, I'll do the housekeeping. So this event is on the record. It's not under the Chatham House rule, despite being in Chatham House. It will be live streamed. It is being live streamed. And there's also, very important, a drinks reception afterwards when this finishes at 7:15 sharp. This is all part of a collaboration between the Internet Society and Chatham House on these issues of consolidation and control. And as part of that, we have a special issue of the Journal of Cyber Policy. We've got some copies of the journal, not the special issue because it's to be done in the spring. But what we have got this evening is a sort of preview of that special issue and some of the topics that will come through. We've got two of our authors here, Jennifer Cobb and Jessie Sowell, and also Andrew Sullivan, who's the President and CEO of the Internet Society. Before we get started with the panellists, I was asked to just set the scene a little bit, not just on the special issue, but what we're talking about. So we're really talking about the bits of the internet you can't see. I think that we're probably all familiar now with the concept that at the application layer, the platforms, the services, whether it's search or social media, that there are a few winners who've come through, whether it's Facebook, Google, or whatever, or Alibaba, Tencent, and so on. Here we're actually digging deeper into the so-called internet layers, what really makes the internet the internet. And when I was getting started in the internet 20 years ago, the sort of exciting elements of it were that it was based on these open, interoperable, very simple protocols, which were open in that they were non-proprietary as well as available to everybody. And that nobody really owned the internet, nobody really controlled it, nobody could be said to be running it. And it was an environment where you had a survivable network, which was so useful during times of conflict or times of crisis, but it was also an environment where there would be permissionless innovation. And when we look back over the last 20 years, whether we agree or disagree about whether we're going in the right direction, I think we could all reflect that there's been incredible innovation, that our lives, we were talking about just before, all of the skills we don't have to have anymore, like map reading, memorizing things, memorizing phone numbers, things that I was actually quite proud that I could do. Like I used to remember everyone's phone number and I could read maps really well. Those are skills now that we don't really need as people. We have the internet instead. So when we look beneath that application layer, whatever we choose to look at, whether it's internet exchange points, which you'll hear about from Jessie, or whether it is those complex supply chains of online services, the same names keep coming up again and again. They're often the same names that we're familiar with from the application layer. But what does this mean, and what does this mean for the internet? We've got a wonderful panel here. I'm not going to do big bios for everybody, but just a quick introduction. Andrew Sullivan, who's the President and CEO of the Internet Society. Jennifer Cobb, who's a Research Associate at the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge. And Jessie Sowell, who's an Assistant Professor at the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service, Texas A&M University. It's quite something for a business card, isn't it? That's quite the title. But welcome to Chatham House, all of you, and thank you for joining this conversation. We'll also throw it open to the floor when we've gone through the initial remarks. So, Andrew, the Internet Society's been a leader in defining really what the characteristics, what you call the invariables of the internet are. We're talking about here consolidation and control. When you start to chip away at those invariables, when you start to have big companies really owning a lot of the infrastructure or running a lot of it. Is it really still the internet, or is it just another network?
It's a good question. There are a couple of dimensions to this that I think are worth thinking about. One is that in some cases, we've seen this before. We've seen periods of consolidation around particular technologies, and then the people who consolidated found themselves in trouble, and they haven't held on. So I remember many years ago, for instance, everybody was panicked that America Online, AOL, was going to take over things and was going to ruin the internet. And instead, of course, they faded away, and we got the contemporary internet. So, and I remember when I was first coming online, everybody thought that Microsoft had basically sewed up the world, and that there was no way that you were ever going to break that monopoly. And yet they don't look so mighty today. I mean, they're still strong, but nothing like everybody was concerned about in 1998, say. So I think that there is there's a dynamic there that I think it's very easy to fall into the mistake of thinking that your current conditions are exactly what's always been true or what's always going to be true. Nevertheless, it's the case that certain kinds of consolidation have the effect of stanching the ability of other people to enter. And I think that that's one of the real questions that we have to ask ourselves. Are we creating an environment in which it's sort of impossible for somebody to come along and make a better mousetrap? And I think the answer to that is wide open. And it's quite interesting because there are two different kinds of pieces to this. One is a development that we've seen over and over again, which really replaces open protocols with proprietary protocol interfaces. So if you think of open protocols, they're the ones that are developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force. Anybody can build on them, anybody can use them, and so on. A lot of online services today are instead developed over so-called APIs, application programming interfaces, that are proprietary things that are basically web services, and they're exposed that way. And what that means is if you're the company who owns that API, you can change it at will. And so if somebody comes along and starts building something that's better than your own stuff on top of your API, you just change the rules, and now it's all over for them. And we've seen this actually happen more than once. So it's by no means a stretch of the imagination, because it's actually happened. So that's one kind of development that I worry about, and I don't know what to think about it. The second kind of issue has to do with the use of formally open protocols like SMTP or DNS or things like that, and yet to see a lot of consolidation around that. So when I first started using the internet, essentially everybody ran their own mail server. So now there's
usually badly. Right?
Generally badly. It turns out that running a mail server well is complicated. Running it badly is really, really easy, and running it so that it doesn't turn into this fountain of spam for everyone else on the internet is quite difficult. And so we saw people gradually offering that service over and over again. And what's interesting is if you look now at the mail systems, there's really between 5 and 10 companies that run them all, and everything else is completely in the noise. So that's a formally open protocol. Anybody could run their own, and yet there are these giants who operate in that environment who really can make or break the market. And that is a case that seems really paradoxical, because you would think that there'd be a natural point at which the consolidation would stop, but instead what we see actually is that there's an acceleration. And I think the economics of that are quite interesting. But again, it's hard to know whether that's something that is just we haven't reached the equilibrium yet, or whether it's something that betrays a real fundamental problem.
And you talk in the Internet Society's Global Internet Report, which was published earlier this year, you talk about this sort of, we've got to a stage where it's rock star economics, where only the largest and most famous can profit. And when we think back to the early days of the internet, where it was this environment where anyone could make their mark, their fortune, that really is a change, isn't it? It's not really going to be possible for two kids to start up the new big thing in their garage anymore, is it?
Well, I think we feel that way anyway. Whether that's true, I think, remains an open question. And I would point out that some of the things that look like rockstar economics are also opportunities for the people in the garages. So from one point of view, for instance, AWS, Amazon Web Services, or any of the other large cloud ones, but I'm going to pick on AWS because they're the biggest concentration here in the UK. They look like an overwhelming dominator of the field. And yet they now deliver, and you can rent by the hour from them, facilities that 10 years ago nobody in the world could afford to build. And that means that if you're starting up, instead of having to build your own data cloud and your own database systems and have all of the storage and everything, which you couldn't have afforded to do, you can get started very, very cheaply and then build up. Now, there's a problem in this market because it turns out that somewhere in the middle of that, it's very easy to go bankrupt because it costs you more to expand. And there are problems, and I think we'll hear a little bit about that, about understanding that supply chain. So I'm not suggesting that it's all puppy dogs and rainbows, but I think that this is one of those things. What is the Tom Waits expression? The large print giveth and the small print taketh away. There's this idea that there's actually some benefit and cost here, and we need not to concentrate only on the cost. That isn't to say we should ignore the costs. I think we should pay attention to them, but we also should pay some attention to the benefits that certain kinds of consolidation can bring us.
And if we have an internet that is now sort of really in the private hands of a few companies, what's the role for the Internet Society in that environment? Because I think of the Internet Society, I might be wrong, but I think of the Internet Society as very much a part and parcel of those original visions of that very open network, that distributed permissionless innovation network. So as we look forward, and particularly to new technologies, the ones that you've been talking about, what will be the role for the Internet Society?
Well, I think that if we head down a path where it really does consolidate down to a few companies, then you would have to ask whether you had really an internet or whether it's really I don't know what you would call it, an oligopoly net or something like that. But I'm not too sure that we're there yet. It seems to me that we're at the top of a hill and we're not exactly sure which way we're going to fall down it. Because the other possibility is that the open protocols on which all of these large companies also depend, remember, they can't turn them off because they need them. So those protocols remain there, and they remain there to be exploited. And so the question is, will there be enough of a critical mass to pull away from this? And some of this is a social policy issue, some of it is economic policy, some of it is industrial policy, some of it is decisions that we each of us have to make. We maybe have the potential that we could head in a different direction, which involves using some of the innovations that some of these large players have provided, and yet using them in the favor of, to the advantage of the people who are trying to build things on the internet.
And so is the Internet Society's role just to observe this, or should you be raging against the dying of the light?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm too comfortable with the dichotomy, because I think maybe the answer is both. I think there is a really serious responsibility to have some clear-headed understanding of what these issues really mean, some measurement of what's actually going on, because I think that's very, very difficult. And I think it's important to understand how difficult it is and why. At the same time, I think that it's necessary to point out when certain kinds of concentrations are unhealthy for the network, what that does to the ability of people to use it. And in a lot of cases, this is not merely a question of sort of politics or values that people have or whatever. There are also technical consequences of it, right? That is, there are certain kinds of innovations that tend only to happen when you've got a pretty healthy disagreement about who's going to win. And when you get strong monopoly, or even just a few players, or when you get regulated monopoly, which is a tradition that we had, you actually see that the innovation tends not to be quite as great. And I think that that's something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. On the other hand, one thing that I've noticed is that some of the consolidating companies have started to act defensively against the fear that they're going to be regulated or that they're going to be broken up. We've seen this in other industries previously. One of those who've listened to me before will know that one of my favorite analogies is with the automotive industry. And one of the things that's quite interesting is to watch car companies as the automotive industry consolidated, because they started to get into a defensive crouch against regulation against them. And that meant that actually a number of innovations that were potential or possibilities in the automotive industry much earlier on only happened later due to regulation. And what's weird is, if we somehow managed to convince them not to worry about regulation, they might have shifted earlier, and yet we ended up in a paradoxical situation.
Thank you. So before moving on to Jennifer, I need to ask you about the sale of .org. For those of you who don't know, the Internet Society owned the registry, domain name registry for .org, or had a financial interest, and has recently sold it. My question to you, Andrew, is were you surprised personally by the ferocity of the reaction from some aspects of the community?
So first of all, I should say that this is a pending transaction, so it hasn't actually completed yet. But I was a little surprised at some of the reaction. I expected that some people were going to be unhappy. I expected that there were some people who would think that this was the wrong thing to do. I expected some people to not to care about it, and I expected some people to be supporters. The people who are opposed to it have been very, very vocal, and I think there's a significant number of them, and I understand that. I do think that we did not perhaps explain ourselves as well as we could have, and that's on me. But I was a little bit taken aback by some of the remarks. But I did expect that some people would oppose it.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer Cobb from the University of Cambridge, you have been looking at the complexity of the supply chains in the online services. So you think you're working with an application, but in fact there's a whole load of stuff going on underneath the surface. So can you just talk to us a little bit about what you discovered, and particularly whether you think that the existing regulations we have are sufficient to sort of cast light upon that?
Sure. So we, as you say, looked at the supply chains of services that really connect together. If you're using an application layer service, actually what's happening in many cases is it's relying on a large number of infrastructure level services to provide whatever functionality it is that you're using. And of course, at infrastructure level, some infrastructural services can themselves be relying on other infrastructural services. So you end up with this supply chain, and it's really a complex system of systems. And the problem is that it's exceptionally complex. And that complexity leads to a couple of different problems. The first and foremost being that it's exceptionally difficult to understand what's happening within that. There's a real lack of transparency around this kind of stuff. The second major problem is that you run the risk of things like emergent property and emergent behaviours arising in that kind of complex environment, which means that you have a supply chain that is unpredictable and potentially unreliable, with significant downstream effects. And unless you can understand how that's functioning, which is difficult to do because of the opacity, it's really very difficult to be able to understand what those effects might be. So we tried a few different legal and technical methods for investigating this complexity to try to figure out what's actually going on. We are very interested in the data flows between these different services, with our idea being that essentially if you can see where the data is going, you can see which services are being used. So we tried some technical mechanisms, and what we found was that if you have a direct relationship, if you as an end user have a direct relationship in some way with the infrastructure service, whether it's taking data from you or returning data to you, then you can, to some degree, just figure out where that data is going to. But it's very much at a very top layer kind of thing. You can't really see into a second level, into a third level kind of thing. There's quite a lot, almost like a barrier at that point. But if you don't have that kind of indirect relationship, it's exceptionally difficult really to figure out what's going on, because there's no mechanism at a technical, or there are very few mechanisms at a technical level to investigate that. From a legal point of view, there are very few frameworks that would require the kind of transparency that would allow you to look into this. The one that we tried using, partly because we're interested in data flows, was GDPR. So in theory, GDPR requires that all processing of personal data would be fair and transparent, which in theory would allow you to figure out where your data is going to. And companies, in complying with their obligations under GDPR, will often put information in their privacy policies. And if you submit a subject access request, you'll also sometimes get information back from them. But what we found was that primarily what they tell you is not actually useful information in any meaningful sense. They tend to tell you that they use categories of third parties rather than which actual third parties. So they might say we transfer data to a range of providers for analytics or something like that, which makes it really very difficult to understand where that's actually going to. There isn't the sort of granularity you might need. There's also kind of the flip side of that is if you have too much granularity, you might kind of be overwhelmed if you're the end user trying to figure this stuff out. But we found that it was a real limitation in trying to figure out what we wanted to figure out. So what we were able to find from our investigation was some evidence of consolidation. We found particularly Google and Facebook services were absolutely dominant in many areas. And of course, Amazon was a big player as well. But we don't have enough evidence to really figure out exactly what's going on. And we don't have the legal and technical mechanisms to really get into this. And I think if we want to be talking about consolidation and perhaps what we should do about consolidation or what kind of responses we need to consolidation, we need, I think, a much better understanding of that consolidation, not just at the sort of top layer of infrastructure, but deeper into those supply chains to figure out what's really going on there. And we probably will need some degree of legal reform to be able to find that. GDPR isn't sufficient. The other legal frameworks that we have themselves also aren't sufficient. We might need to try to align the incentives for these service providers to provide more information. A lot of this stuff would be commercially sensitive to some extent. A lot of the commercial pressures would be to not reveal where data flow is going. And I think we need to try to shift those incentives in some way to try to open that up a bit, whether that's through legal reform or policy reform or whatever else. But yeah, those would be the things that we would recommend.
Can you just sort of like rolling back a bit, why is this important either for the internet? Why does it matter to an internet user? If they're just using a service, what would they care really about all of the different twists and turns in the supply chain? Why does this matter? Apart from the interesting, it's obviously an interesting research project to see if you can find it out, but why does it matter?
I think for end users, it's not everybody is going to care where their data is going. I think we know that from the way that people engage with the sort of application layer services. A lot of people don't really care what happens with their data. But I think there are a core of people who do genuinely care and actually have a reason to understand where their data is going and are perhaps privacy conscious or perhaps just interested in this kind of stuff. But I think the real benefit isn't necessarily for end users themselves. It's for researchers or policymakers or regulators to really understand what's going on here. If we're talking about systems that are heavily consolidated, these systems can be quite fragile. If the infrastructure services provided by one company go down, a whole range of application layer services then could themselves go down. There could be quite critical things that we might rely on in society more generally. There could be quite trivial things, but that's a problem. And I think unless we as researchers or academics or policymakers or regulators have a better way of understanding what's actually going on below the surface, we can't possibly begin to come up with responses to try to address those kinds of things.
Yeah, because it sort of goes back to Andrew's point about the resilience of the network. An example that you gave in your paper is about how one expired certificate managed to take down O2's global network and also a mobile provider in Japan. And so you see when you have that sort of very consolidated supply chain, you can have surprisingly big results. And of course, Andrew lived through the Dyn attacks and all of the follow-on, the implications of that. So as a policymaker, what questions should policymakers be asking about these supply chains at the moment?
I think the big question really is to be asking of service providers, whether at infrastructure level or whether at application level, where is your data going to? What data are you getting back from people? What services are you engaging with? Why are you engaging with those services? And when we can ask those kind of questions, we can begin to map out data flows, we can begin to map out the consolidation. We can begin to map out what kind of services are perhaps more consolidated than others, because it's not necessarily the case that it's a uniform kind of level of consolidation. But I think until we start asking those questions and until we start really investigating this a bit more, we're kind of in the dark to a large extent about this.
So we need to really respond to what the evidence is showing us, what the data is showing us in a way. Thank you very much. I'm going to move now to Jessie Sowell. So you have been looking at internet exchange points and consolidation from that perspective. Could you just, there's people in the room I can see who know exactly what an internet exchange point is, but there's probably one or two who don't. Could you just explain what they are, but also, talk to us about the impact of consolidation in that area of the infrastructure, and whether it's a good or bad thing, speaking simplistically?
Sure. So building a little bit on Andrew's framing and this notion that like the power of private networks. I mean, the internet is a network of largely private networks, and somewhere geographically, in many points around the world, you actually have to interconnect those networks. And a lot of these folks are nominal competitors. They don't necessarily want to build their infrastructure into the facilities of their competitor, and vice versa. So in many areas around the world, around the late 1990s, folks said, we don't want to pay exorbitant prices to like AT&T and Cogent and all the big telecom providers to move our bits across the ocean or move our bits around the world. We're network engineers. We can build our own interconnection facilities. We can build our own facilities to connect our networks to keep our local traffic local. And in many ways, that's the essence of what an internet exchange is. It is there to ensure that the networks that are geographically close to each other, their traffic stays geographically proximate. And they have evolved from just moving traffic back and forth amongst local actors to becoming these platforms supporting markets for a lot of the infrastructure services that animate the internet. So you have folks that are, you have transit providers, you have transport, you have a lot of the mechanics of moving bits back and forth, but you also have DDoS mitigation services that are increasingly seeing these platforms as places to deploy and places to be able to absorb a lot of DDoS attack traffic. So in many ways, these internet exchanges are the baseboards for connecting the networks that make up the internet together. And geographically, in terms of where they're distributed, they are, when we think about this consolidation debate, we think about this notion of concentration. It's often the case that you want to have one or maybe two of these exchanges in a given metro area. The whole point is to have economies of scale. The point is to have one-stop shopping for all of your interconnection needs. So if you go to this market, you want to be able to find all the other networks in that region. You want to be able to find all the other folks that you want to interconnect with in one place. And when we think about the larger discourse around consolidation, I think there's a really, building on some of the discussions we had earlier, whether this notion of, again, I'm going to steal some of Andrew's points. When we ask about the question of whether concentration is good or bad, I think building on Jennifer's points, yes, we see a lot of negative consequences of what we call consolidation, but I think one of the major problems in some of the discourse that we see, especially in the media, is that we're confounding this notion of consolidation and the negative anti-competitive consequences of consolidation with concentration and economies of scale. And I would argue that in many ways, the concentration and economies of scale are necessary to get a lot of the benefits that Andrew pointed out, these small actors that by virtue of being able to get on AWS, playing on, again, the AWS example, yes, we see some degree of consolidation or concentration, and yes, we see that there is some degree of power by being in one facility, but it also gives these small and medium-sized actors the global reach that they wouldn't necessarily have, and they don't necessarily have the expertise or funding to invest in. So I would go, when I look at this, I look back at the internet exchanges and I see that, their governance mechanisms, the means by which they manage their concentrated platforms, they have intentionally developed specific sets of norms, and these sets of norms are developed by nominal competitors, by folks like Google, Akamai, BT, AT&T. These folks have gotten together and said, we need this common platform to interconnect. It is beneficial for all of us to have this common platform, and as a consequence, this common market. So they have identified effective norms like non-compete and neutrality that keeps the platform in check, that ensures that platform does not go off the rails, and that they have a voice in how that's managed. And in essence, a diverse set of sub-industries all have a voice in how that platform is run. And when we think about that as in going back to the story of whether concentration is good or bad, we see there is the possibility for these very same actors that we are critiquing at the application layer. Folks from those firms have been able to develop governance mechanisms for a concentrated platform that are effective, that have the kind of transparency and accountability that I hear in Jennifer's comments. And so for me, a lot of this discussion, consolidation, the consolidation debate is an opportunity to say, can we innovate in the regulatory space and not go to one end of the spectrum and just fine the heck out of folks for behaving badly, not go to the other end of the structural divestiture spectrum where we say just break them up, but how can we take the insights from neutrality and non-compete? How can we not necessarily cookie cutter, copy and paste them up into the application layer, but how can we use those insights and see, yes, these firms are willing to engage in these cooperative norm building efforts to manage a platform. How can we transfer those insights to the application layer?
It's a very interesting point that you make about the governance of these internet exchange points was really quite thoughtfully set out at an early stage, that the risk was recognized, that these are powerful nodes on the internet. You've got competitors all sharing traffic. You've got all sorts of things that if you were doing a risk analysis, there would be raising red flags, but that they set up those norms that you speak about. Have you got any examples of the norms working in practice? You said, if it goes off the rails, if something bad happens. Can you give us any examples of, because we all can experience or can recall things that look like a fig leaf, that is sort of, we have a multi-stakeholder panel that will stop anything bad happening, but actually it doesn't really mean anything. Do these norms really have teeth in practice?
So I would say that yes, they do, and there's two good examples of that. One is right here at home in London, the London Internet Exchange in their early days, and so a slight modification. Whenever you say that these norms were really well thought out, they were really well thought out, but it was a process of experimentation. These folks in the late 1990s, they didn't just come along and say, neutrality, non-compete, and mutuality are our canonical norms, and magic will happen after that. They had to do a lot of experimentation. So in London, folks got together and said, why are we paying these exorbitant transit costs to send our traffic across the pond and back just to go up the street in London? They came together, I think somebody in the audience can probably correct me, but they had a little Spark box that was essentially their core router that they plugged into, and they said, we're all network engineers, we can put this together, we can actually save ourselves some money. We are still nominal competitors, we can save ourselves some money exchanging traffic amongst ourselves. And that was initially a volunteer effort. That was something that they put together. It was just a bunch of engineers that got together and said, "Hey, we're going to build this, and we're going to save ourselves some money." But as people started using it more, they saw that there was a demand for more professionally managed services. They wanted stronger guarantees that this little box and the larger set of switches that grew out of that, and then this multi-node platform that became the Lynx platform that now we have platforms around the UK. They wanted stronger guarantees about that. But in those early days, whenever they were transitioning from the volunteer model to a more firm-based model where they said it's not just a bunch of volunteers, but we're going to hire staff engineers to manage and monitor these switches and make sure we have service level agreements in place that say that we're going to have this uptime. There was a period of time where they thought about going commercial, where they thought about moving from this non-profit, communal-based, mutually-based model. And so that was a big inflection point for them. And the community, i.e. the industry said, the industry actors at play, it was a contentious debate, but they did say, we want to maintain management of this. We do not want to see this taken over by large actors that just have their single profit motive at play. We like to have this management role. So there was this element of what we would call in the policy world policy experimentation, norm experimentation, and that's really that big inflection point for them. The other story that I really like to tell is the one of France IX. And so back in, if I remember my dates correctly, back in 2008, a lot of folks, some of whom are in the room, pointed me to look at France IX as an example of, and Paris was a really bad place to interconnect back in 2008. There were the market for interconnection facilities was very fragmented. There was like 8 to 10 very small places where you could interconnect, and most of them were managed rather poorly. And a few folks from some of our consolidation objects in this discussion, Google and Akamai, two international firms, and then Jaguar and Neo Telecom, two French firms, the four of them got together and essentially said to the rest of the community, the rest of the European industry, said, would you like to see a common platform in Paris? Would you like to see a mutually managed, a commonly managed platform? Would you be willing to pay for it? They actually put together a survey and sent this out to industry, and industry actors came back and said, yes, we would. That would be really great. That'd be really nice. And they went ahead and they built that platform, and they built France IX. And France IX is now one of the most successful internet exchanges in Europe, and I would argue also in the world. And this is an example of where they took that deep experience from those experimental days. One of the co-founders that I interviewed for my research literally said they took the Articles of Association of two of the biggest internet exchanges in the world and compared them and said, I'm going to take the best pieces of both. I'm going to tweak it a little bit for the modern internet, and we're going to create this model. So I wouldn't say that these norms just came, that they were made purely by design. They were made by experiment, but in effect, these actors, these nominal competitors, came along and corrected a dysfunctional interconnection market in a particular region. And I think that's a fantastic illustration of how you can build a platform that under certain antitrust literature would be considered a concentrated platform and created a concentrated market that yet is still managed by the industry itself, by the broader set of industry actors, not just a single firm. So when we look at this, the big difference between these platforms at the baseboards of the internet and the application layer is here we have an illustration of really good governance norms for a concentrated platform, whereas at the application layer we say, okay, we have a single actor that's often a participant in the markets their platform is directly supporting. How can we transfer those norms?
So just very quickly, because I'm going to open the floor for questions, so please think about your questions. Just a very quick one on that. How confident are you that you could actually apply similar norms to companies that are now very well established, extremely powerful, and as you said yourself, they operate for profit, for their own profit motive? Do you think that those sort of touchy-feely IX type of norms are really those could be applied to those platforms?
So I'm not, I'm not quite sure that they're not necessarily touchy-feely. They're absolutely there because these actors at that level have to collaborate. So whenever I look at applying these kinds of norms, neutrality, non-compete, as a way to kind of encourage these platforms to share additional information, this is where I'm going to drag Jennifer into this answer because she's looked at more of the supply chain at the application layer than I have, is that what they have is by virtue of these individuals, these participants being experts, they know what to look for. They know precisely what to look for. So the challenge at the application layer is taking an even more diverse set of participants on these platforms, encouraging them to say, what kinds of questions do they need to ask? What kinds of supply chain questions do they need to ask to avoid the emergent behaviors that Jennifer is concerned with, and I'm quite honestly concerned with as well? And how do we, from the regulatory side, what is the appropriate regulatory incentive to make these powerful actors introduce these accountability mechanisms, these transparency mechanisms? So in my case, the participants can see precisely how their data is used. Looking at Amazon Marketplace, how are those third-party participants, how is their information about the risk they're taking introducing new products and services, how is Amazon using that? Is Amazon using that just to say, oh, look at them, they took a risk, they deployed an interesting service or an interesting product, now we're just going to go and deploy it ourselves, and oh, if they can't keep up, too bad, so sad. Being able to have that kind of information, that kind of transparency about precisely how that data is used, that for me is one of the million-dollar questions. But I think what comes out of the IX work is that you do see that these competitors can actually come to some degree of common accord. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's an extraordinary challenge that lives between, again, this fine-based behavioral structure and complete divestiture.
Andrew, you had a quick point on this?
Yeah, to double down a bit on that, I think that there's an important point about this, that it's not only a regulatory or social problem that we're talking about. This isn't merely a policy issue. The policy issues that Jennifer was talking about are also technical problems. If you're designing that service, and you simply don't know that actually this thing is consolidated upstream and you're dependent on a single point of failure, you are really in trouble. You're designing what you think is a reliable service, and instead it turns out to be 3 steps down, critically dependent on a single point of failure that you thought you designed around. So actually, there are just good, solid technical reasons to be informing people of these things as well.
Thank you very much. Anybody like to ask a question? Okay. Okay, so Maria at the back. Just wait for a mic, because we're being live streamed, so.
Just on the single point of failure thing. Oh, sorry. I'm Maria Farrell. I'm a writer and speaker about tech and the future. I met Tom Layton of Akamai last year, and he was saying that they're a big CDN, that they host 19 of the top 20 American banks. And I was asking him afterwards, I was saying, are you not worried about that? Like, it's potentially and he said, his answer was, no, because we're really good at what we do. And I think they are. But I'm still a little worried, so I was just wondering about hearing a bit more on that.
Okay, thank you. Shall I take, I'll take these three from Joyce and Stacey down the front, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Hi, I'm Stacey Hoffman from Oxford Information Labs. I work a lot in technical standards, so I know quite a bit about this area. And what I see happening right now is an internet that will be fundamentally different in 5 years. We've got 5G that's moving a lot of services and tools to the operators level, the infrastructure. We've got DNS over HTTPS, which is moving resolution to an application layer in many respects, or could do. And then we've got actors like China who are looking to centralize or consolidate things like data collection. So looking at all the different incentives for this state actors and in industry, do we really need to just rethink our internet layers in terms of what consolidation will mean for us in the very near future?
Thank you very much for this very interesting, engaging panel. My name is Joyce Hagme. I work here at Chatham House with the International Security Department, and I'm also with Emily, co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. My question is, and also thank you for talking about the challenges and opportunities about internet consolidation in terms of the newcomers and what that means, and also how they are also supported by these big platforms. And we've been hearing increasingly by some politicians calling for the breakup of these tech firms. And I guess my question is this the right approach to the issue of consolidation? And if not, what are the risks that are associated with it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great questions. I think those could keep us going for the rest of the evening, but I'm coming back out to the audience for more questions. So, are you worried about that sort of example of Akamai looking after 18 of the 19 biggest banks or whatever it was? Even if Akamai are not worried, should we be? When we think about the internet in the next 5 years, whether it's 5G, DNS over HTTPS, or what China is doing with centralized data connection, do we need to rethink the internet layers? Do we need to rethink those invariables and describe them differently? And is breakup the right, hard to do, but is it the right response to the sort of consolidation that we're seeing? Who'd like to go first? You don't have to do all of them, just pick one, but do pick one. Jennifer.
In response to Maria's question, the question that these people seem to think they're completely infallible in some way. We've seen this happen with Facebook, for example, over the years, where people have said to them, you have a problem, this is going to be, in a couple of years' time, it's going to be a real issue. And they've said, well, we couldn't possibly have a problem, you're being daft. No, we don't have a problem. A couple of years later, they go, actually, we think we might have a problem here, we might actually have missed something. And then at some point, it turns out it's actually a really serious thing. It's kind of like something that nobody really knows how to deal with because they were completely unwilling to address it when people were telling them about this. So I think it's probably the case that a lot of these companies think they're really good at what they do, and they're really good at security, they're really resilient, they're really reliable, but actually in practice, that's maybe not necessarily the case. And I think we have to not really take them at their word for this. We have to kind of say, look, it's great that you think that, but I don't want to rely on your kind of delusions of infallibility, and we did try to find a different way to figure this out.
In fairness, a lot of them are very good at what they do, and probably better. I think this is part of what Jesse was talking about, and what you were talking about as well, Andrew. Is that, you know, whether it's on resilience or cybersecurity or just the professionally run network, a lot of these companies that have become so successful do so because they're good and we like their services. But yeah, point taken there.
There's one thing that one of my interview subjects very early on in my research highlighted to me is this saying that might scare some people, but it's a fantastic quote. Is that in the early days of the internet, if as a network engineer, as a peering manager, if you haven't fat fingered something, which means you make the equivalent of a typo on a routing announcement that says who you should talk to and how, if you haven't knocked out 30 to 40% of the internet at some point in time in your career, you're not doing it right. But the corollary to that is doing it once is learning, doing it twice is incompetence. And so that mentality amongst a lot of the network operators that I work with is that there is some degree of some of the conversation we had earlier, moving fast, breaking things. And there's something to be said for that experimental model, that permissionless innovation, that ability to do those experiments, because there's just as much you can learn about breaking something when you break something as there is from saying, oh, I've done it well. And so I agree that there are plenty of people out there that are extraordinarily overconfident, but I think there's also a counterbalance that there's lots and lots of really great operators and engineers that are out there that have said, you know, when we will inevitably break something, that's going to happen, but you have to have the discipline to actually learn from that mistake, and that's something that I think is invaluable. I think it's something that's very characteristic of an industry that has to manage this extraordinarily complex system.
Well, this is an interesting point that I want to pick up on in order to address this question of whether there's something fundamental that we need to rethink. Because actually one of the things that I think we see in some of those efforts, and not just in the efforts that you mentioned, but in fact in a number of other regulatory efforts, in the idea that, oh, well, we'll magically break up these firms and then everything will be fine, is a kind of magical thinking that, you know, the managerial approach of centralization is going to solve this problem for us. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that the solution that many people seem to be proposing to the problems that we're seeing on the internet that arise from consolidation and concentration is, oh, I know, we'll just replace the concentration. Instead of leaving it up to, say, Facebook's engineers or AWS's or Tencent's or whoever you like, we'll put the government in charge of this thing and then it'll be fine. And that's a bizarre design, right? The clever thing that we did with the internet was to build a reliable system out of unreliable parts. And the reason we did that was because we depended on the idea that, yes, somebody was going to fat finger things and they were going to take down 30% of their connections. And the solution to that was just to expect it to happen. The previous architecture depended on perfection, and it was extraordinarily good. But when it failed, boy howdy, did it go bad. And so the solution to that was not to have that problem. And I think the point that Jennifer has been making in her research is precisely that we are wandering into that problem by accident because we're obscuring from ourselves the fact that we've actually got these single points of failure. But another way we could do it, for instance, is with a new IP system that centralizes management so tightly that in fact you don't actually have the intelligence out at the edge. You put all the intelligence back into the network. Well, we tried that thing and it fails hard. So don't do it again. And you would think that we would learn that. I almost feel like we're going to demonstrate sort of empirically that old saw that those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And so I'm quite nervous about that for that reason.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sir at the front.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Cumhur from Morton, from the Turkey, which Wikipedia still blocked. I would like to ask the Tor. You know, there's another network that you can reach with the Tor. It's called Dark Web, and also the blockchain. These things are trying to create decentralized internet, but we are talking about more centralization, consolidation, And what do you think about this subject? Because the thing is, we are not aware of whole Tor network, which is very decentralized. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Ian Groves. I work for Fujitsu. It's along the lines of your question, but in a slightly different way. Where you talked about collaboration rather than competition, that was only done for economic or technical reasons and was done at quite a low level in the internet. And trying to extrapolate that further up the stack, I think, is going to be a problem. But we talked a lot about centralization, government. My question is, where centralized? Which government?
Okay, so where centralised, which government, and also is Tor or the dark web, the blockchain, are they going to bring us back into a decentralised network? Who'd like to have a go at those?
So I guess I can answer the question about the cooperation at the. And so it's an old term, but it wasn't necessarily pure cooperation or pure competition. It's that notion of coopetition, which you kind of implied with your, or I think you implied. I don't want to put words in your mouth, with regards to the economic and technical rationale and incentives for this. I do want to clarify that I'm not suggesting that we cookie cutter just push these exact norms and rule structures up the stack, but I think that those particular norms, this notion of non-compete, that the platform should not directly compete with the participants on that platform. These notions of neutrality, that the participants, that the platform should be neutral with respect to all of its participants. It should not necessarily privilege any particular sub-industry or any particular subset of those. I think those as principles for governing a concentrated platform are useful learnings that we can take and insights that we can apply. Do I think that it's easy to do? Do I think that there's a single hegemon that can do that can come in and enforce that? No, it's a transnational internet. That's something that I often have to tell my students. Often say, like, well, can't the government come in? And I'm like, which one? And it's just not feasible. So I don't necessarily mean to come across as I have the answer, but I think the lesson here is that we have two instances of concentrated platforms, and at a conceptual level, they are similar, and we have one that's governed effectively, and one that is suffering from bad governance. It's not the fault of concentration. It's not a consequence of economies of scale. It is a consequence of bad governance. So can we take those insights and apply them? Can we say, how can we incent the application layer firms? How can we incent Google to give us more information about how our information is used for ads? Facebook, how our information is used for ads? Can we incent them when we say, like, you are potentially following Jennifer's argument, like, you are providing services that are actually quite critical? What incentives can we give them to say, you need to give us a little bit more information about your supply chain and give us stronger guarantees? And so we saw that at the IX level too. We saw the demand from industry and in some cases government say, we need stronger guarantees that these platforms will continue to function as we expect. We can no longer follow this idea that, oh, it's just going to magically create this collateral public good. No, we have to actually have those stronger guarantees. So it's still it's quite an open question about the precise mechanics, but I think we shouldn't ignore these lessons we can learn. Does that kind of give a relatively decent answer to your question?
Yeah, to a point.
To a point,
I
yeah.
think there's a financial element that is missing here. Further up the stack, the financial reward is much higher.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's harder.
Thank you. So just for those watching on the live stream, the point was that as you go up further in the stack, the financial rewards are much higher. So the incentives to collaborate and cooperate and sort of throw yourself open to a sort of that mutuality that we see down at the IX level perhaps is less applying. Jennifer, which government?
That's a good question. I think the first thing I want to talk about is probably the Tor blockchain question. I think we can look for technical solutions to this if we want, but actually a large part of the problem is the business models of the companies who are doing this. who rely on getting more data, growing in scale, operating at transactional level, and are fundamentally driven purely by profit. You can get them to introduce things like Tor or use things like blockchain if you want, but as long as the drive towards more data, bigger scale, more money is a fundamental component of this, it's not going to solve that problem, I don't think. It's also why I think breaking up these companies isn't necessarily the best idea, because it kind of assumes that there is some degree of a market solution to a market problem, and I'm not necessarily sure that that's true. I think actually we need much more creative and inventive ways of dealing with this. I think you're right that there has been sort of bad governance to some degree with this. We haven't really stepped in and we've taken a very hands-off approach to this kind of thing. I think we need to be much more interventionist, much more active, and that brings us back to the question of which government. Which is an exceptionally difficult question to answer. There's no straightforward answer to that. But what we have seen is that certain regulatory blocks can influence very significantly the way that technologies develop, particularly in Europe with GDPR. We've seen the emergence of sort of privacy-enhancing technologies and this kind of thing. But because of the size of the European bloc, because of the size of the single market, the evolution of European data protection laws had a significant impact on the evolution of data protection law in other jurisdictions as well. It's not necessarily the case that we need to create a harmonised set of global rules across this, but if you have a bloc the size of, say, Europe that is willing to take the lead on this, then that can have sort of knock-on effects and move this on. And I think the other thing just is to come up is this idea of neutrality, and that we should be having these infrastructure services being neutral. I'm not sure that's necessarily a realistic option. I don't think they can ever be neutral. I don't think it's a neutral act to say keep 8chan online because you decide you want to give it DDoS protection. That's not a neutral act whenever people are learning on 8chan how to attack mosques in Christchurch. These aren't neutral things. These aren't neutral services. We know from research that's been done by Langdon Winner, by Lawrence Lessig, people like that, there's no such thing as neutral infrastructure. It always constrains and shapes and permits and allows behaviour. And we kind of have to be aware of that. We can't just go, this is a neutral thing, it should be neutral. We have to be aware of those things, I think.
Andrew, I'm going to go out to another question, if I may. There's a chat there and then Philip. That's right. Okay. Oh, should we take these three? We'll take these three questions together. Do you want to start with you and then go?
So if the internet's going dark, will there be a role for the Chatham House rule on the internet of the future? And reference Andrew's defence of the .org. Why should I give a .fig for the US national domain?
Thank you.
Like .com, the US national domain, so I don't really care.
So, thank you. And then we've got a gentleman there.
Hi, Michael Cooper, a member of Chatham House. I was intrigued by a couple of points that Jessie made particularly, but if I look at internet generally, you could argue that it's been slowing down and struggling with more and more things over a longer period. We've had an addressing problem for a couple of decades. TCP is known to be problematic, and fixes and corrections to that just can't get out. So we can recognise problems, but we can't seem to fix them. Do we not need concentration either in the form of government or large companies who've got very smart people and the resources to actually drive forward the changes that are probably needed for the internet?
Thank you for that. And just the gentleman behind you, if you'd pass the microphone back.
I was intrigued by the comment that Akamai host so many of the American banks. I would have assumed, however, that the American banks, like the British banks, have 4 or 5 cloud suppliers and they multiple source. And we've got in one direction this drive for consolidation, economies of scale and so on. But any large corporate, if they are critically dependent on online services, are going for multiple independent routings via multiple independent technologies using multiple suppliers. The only glue is the fact that these things can communicate with each other via IP. Now, is there not, because of the sheer need of industry and of government for critical national infrastructure and resilience, a force that's driving in the other direction very healthily?
Thank you. So, a range of questions there. One about .org, or really a sort of I don't care about .org, but also a very interesting point here about, don't we, where you have a single company that can do something, they can implement changes very quickly that we haven't been able to do with, say, IPv6 adoption, for example. And then the sort of the fact that if you've got 4 or 5 suppliers and are you genuinely resilient? I suppose a lot depends on whether those 4 or 5 suppliers really are, whether they don't just all terminate at one point and it's in fact one provider. This is why we need to know about supply chains. Can I come to you first, Andrew, on those points, and then we'll come back?
Sure. So I didn't fully understand the question about .org, but since it's I don't care, I guess that's okay. The point about V6 and this point about multiple providers is actually 2 poles in the, or 2 ends of a discussion that's going on there in a market that is consolidating in ways that might be dangerous, and I think that that's the central point. There's not a lot of evidence that single operators are any better at V6 adoption than anybody else is. Or to pick another example, DNSSEC, which is a similar sort of thing. There have been a number of governments who have mandated certain kinds of adoption across their entire operation. And I mean, this is literally the government on government-owned infrastructure, and they often can't get it done anyway. So the idea that, sort of magically, if we just scaled that up to the whole internet, it would work, I'm skeptical at the very least, because I mean, the real question is there a real problem here? And I think, in the case of V6 adoption, for instance, we've actually seen market mechanisms work there. It's just that it's turned out that it's been much more catastrophic change than we expected. That is, people seem to be willing to hang on to their like lousy old approach to things and like add more and more epicycles on the outside of their model until finally it just collapses and then they go all the way over. And so I think that what's interesting about that is the question of whether somebody has actually done this diligence. Because I think in a lot of the providers, what you see is incrementalism tends to be preferred. And this is true of engineering generally, right? Engineers like incremental solutions because it's better to just build a little thing on top of the stuff you've got than to think about it, sort of more deeply. Under those circumstances, then, the question is, okay, if this supply chain is really long, because I think this is an absolutely critical point for providers. Yes, banks and other people are trying to put themselves in multiple clouds. But if it all turns out that they're completely dependent on a single provider, some way down the stream, and this is true at every layer. I want to point this out. I mean, we used to see this all the time in data centers. People would be like completely redundant connectivity and everything like that, and you'd go like 4 kilometers down the road and you'd find the trench in which all of the cables came together. And naturally, that was the place that the backhoe showed up. And that's how we know, right? Because the backhoe showed up, and so we got a hole in the ground and we got a hole in the fiber. It was actually interesting. Near my hotel, I was watching them do this one day, and I was like, I'm pretty sure that's some fiber, and sure enough. And so this is still a problem today, and I think that that's the critical point. So I think in terms of this question about neutrality and whether there's a policy thing, I think it would be very, very interesting to say, look, as an urgent public matter, there are certain cases where you absolutely need to be able to trace this thing all the way back. I'm pretty sure that the Department of Defense people really do know where their cables go, and I'm pretty sure they really do know who owns them, and I'm pretty sure that under those circumstances they can force redundancy if they need to. But why should it be only the Department of Defense that has that? And I think that that's a critical policy question that I think would be good to address under these circumstances.
Jennifer, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the question, should we be waiting for one company to try to change these things, or one government to try to change these things? I think the fact that we even consider the possibility that one company could change these things is in and of itself a bad sign, because it means that company has a significant amount of power over how the infrastructure works, and that's probably not a good thing, really. The way that this is consolidated, the way that it operates, it means that a very small number of companies are operating at an absolutely critical level in society completely without any degree of accountability, without any sort of legal framework constraining them in any particular way. They can exercise that power essentially freely, however they want. And I think the question is a really revealing one because it brings up all those issues. And I think I would much rather wait for a government to change things than for one company to decide, because it's commercially advantageous to it, to try to fundamentally change how these things work.
I guess the way I heard that question slightly differently. And so part of your question was, should we encourage companies to make some of these investments in pushing forward that because they can? And so, for instance, if we go back to, again, late 90s, early 2000s, whenever we look at some of these intermediary services that we now know and love and enjoy, cloud compute, CDNs, et cetera, in those days, that was one or two companies that were sufficiently well-heeled, either through VC money or some other means, that were able to go and innovate and develop, and it was a risky proposition, and there was a lot of learning and risk-taking involved in deploying some of these large-scale CDNs. But now we see that CDNs are, and I know a few people in the audience might throw something at me for saying this, CDNs are
content delivery networks.
Sorry, content delivery networks, I apologize.
A way of getting the content very close to the user, often a make or break thing in an internet exchange point. Sorry, just to jump in with the...
Sorry, I was too comfortable with my language. Sorry, these content delivery networks that essentially make sure that your Netflix doesn't jitter because the content caches are close enough to you that it has much shorter path to get interfered with or to experience congestion. A lot of these folks in the early days of developing the necessary technologies for making that work for a lot of things that we really enjoy, they had to make those investments, they had to make those innovations, and there were only a few at the time, and in those early days, those guys were the concentrated market makers in that space. But as technology does, it was commodified, and now we see that, and this is where some people in the room might throw stuff at me, is that CDNs are now a dime a dozen. A lot of the big actors that relied on CDNs in the early days, Apple for one, Netflix for another, they have now gone off and made their own special purpose CDNs. So in many ways, there is some virtue to elements of what was baked into your question, which is that sometimes you need these big actors to use their capital resources to invest and innovate and push these things forward. Not only just the technological innovation of how do we make an efficient cache, how do we do effective geolocation, but how do we develop that deep operational knowledge about how to deploy it in this complex network that is not something you can do in a lab. You have to do it in a live internet, and that's actually a risky proposition. So
with 5 minutes to go just before drinks, I think we've got time for one more round of questions. I think we had...
Is there a role for Chatham House?
Okay, so we'll ask the panel to respond to that as well. So I've got a chap you were waiting at the front, so can we get the microphone to you? Did you? And then the chap at the back, and then I think we'll come back for some closing remarks.
Okay. Emmanuel, member of Chatham House. I want to find out if, as far as to Jesse, in integration of for example, DNS in the internet integration, how can different scaling techniques, can that be useful at all? Is that related only to policy or to the technical aspect of it?
Sorry, just to make sure I understand, you're asking about different scaling techniques.
Yes, different scaling technique. Which of these techniques are applicable to policy or to the technical side of the integration?
Thank you very much. Before you answer that, actually, I've got two questions. So we'll go to Patricia and then the gentleman behind you.
Thanks, Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. So just a quick question. What difference is quantum computing going to make to the internet?
Thank you.
Should I give you my question while you're thinking about the answer to that one?
Yes, please give your question.
Stephen Castell, independent consultant. Kind of related, we all interface with the internet through applications, essentially. Beneath the application, I mean, this is what this seminar is about, what lies beneath the application layer. Well, what does lie beneath it is a whole lot of other software that we as users don't directly interface with. I think largely that software is kind of dumb.
It works to standards. It works to the standards implicit in the IP protocol and all the layers, the communication layers. I guess there may be some intelligent software to do with routing and rerouting of the transport layer for load sharing or for failure of a node. But that's deep down in somewhere in the servers of the communication software. To what extent do any of you see more intelligent software coming further up near the application layer, so it's not in the domain of any one particular application supplier, like an Apple or a website owner or a Google or a Facebook, but could it be very intelligent that we could all get out and use the intelligence, but also its intelligence will be monitoring our use of it much more at the gross internet level, not through one particular person's. And then who does the results of all that intelligence then belong to?
Yeah, thank you very much. So a lot there, and I'm going to ask all of our panelists to keep their remarks really brief so that we get to close on time. Starting with the last question. Is about more intelligence in the network. I suppose 5G, we have a more intelligent software-driven network, but who owns that? Who owns the results of that? Will quantum change things, and how? There's the question about integration, scaling, and also the role of Chatham House in the internet of the future, in this consolidated network. Jesse, shall we just start with you? A couple of quick remarks, and then we'll come back, Jennifer, and close with you, Andrew.
So I think there is quite a lot of opportunities for integration and scaling. I mean, that's fundamentally what has made the internet work from the beginning. I think what's really interesting is when we look at some of these non-state institutions, some of these groups like the IX associations like EuroIX or AFIX or pick your favorite IX association, they are about sharing information that is necessary for scaling of at least internet exchanges in this case. But I know that there are other operator groups that also are concerned with this. So I think there are opportunities, and I'm happy to chat more during drinks just to close this off and move to the next one.
Thank you. Jennifer.
I guess the first question that I'll answer is the role of Chatham House. I think
specifically the Chatham House rule, attribution and anonymity.
Okay, I think that's not necessarily challenged by the internet. I think there's a degree to which once you put things on the internet, everyone can see it, but also things tend to disappear from the internet as well. But I think anonymity is many times a good thing. There's not any necessary reason to take that away. I think that's probably fair enough. The question about more intelligent software, it sounds like you're kind of asking whether we should roll out like a really extensive global surveillance apparatus, and I think that's probably we do, but I mean we don't need another one. I think that's maybe not a great idea. And then the quantum, what difference does it make? I guess in the short, medium, and perhaps even long term, probably none, because we're probably years away from it.
Well, Google did say that. I think that there was that last year or a few months ago there was an announcement. Was it from Google about quantum?
We've got quantum networks being set up now.
Okay, Andrew.
Well, the fact that people have managed to get something to work doesn't mean that they can get it to deploy. I have personally been responsible for several things that I managed to get to work but couldn't get to deploy. I want to take these three bits about the Chatham House rule, the quantum computing, and the question of this sort of complete surveillance system as one question, because I think that there's an important point here. The current approach, look, the internet is maybe the most human technology we have ever invented. Its entire point is to get communications from one end of a thing to another end of a thing without putting a lot of intermediaries in the middle. And that's an ingenious mechanism that we've come up with. We recognize that there are all these intermediaries, and what we've done is we've gradually given people a toolkit by which they can build themselves a network, such as Tor that was mentioned earlier, that allows you to do things in a way that preserves your anonymity, perhaps it preserves your freedom, perhaps it preserves the things that you want to do, whatever it is. There are a lot of interests aligned against that. And one of the dangers from quantum computing is just that like the sheer horsepower that it gives, because it's going to roll out in an uneven way, right? Some people are going to get it first, means that we've got a potential threat to the way that this technology has been deployed. Because right now we have ubiquitous technology, right? Like every one of us is carrying around way more power than the original imps way back on the ARPANET. That means that we need actually public discussion about those kinds of issues. Many people accuse me from time to time of being too interested in the technology in my job at the Internet Society, and I disagree with them because I think actually the real questions here are mostly not technological. Most of them are sort of social ones. But what that means is that we need, in fact, to have that conversation. We need to have the conversation about how we're going to address the various threats. The approaches that we've been taking so far to these kinds of threats are to get the large various platforms together in a closed room most of the time to make decisions about how that surveillance is going to work. And so then the question, will the Chatham House rule be possible, is one that we actually have to keep alive for ourselves. Is this something that we can trust? Will we be able to trust our devices, or will they be tattling on us all of the time? The current designs that people are proposing sort of require that the devices be tattling all the time, because we're getting end-to-end encrypted. If we're getting end-to-end encrypted, the only place that you're going to be able to do that surveillance is on the end. And it seems that the current push is towards that kind of surveillance. So I think the real question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to have that debate honestly? Because maybe we want to build a better surveillance system for the globe. I personally don't, but I mean, maybe that's the social choice we make. But if we make that social choice, it seems to me we ought to do it with our eyes wide open. And I think that that's something that maybe we're not having an honest discussion about.
Thank you very much. That brings this part of our session to a close. There is a reception upstairs. I would like to thank the audience for your questions and your participation, and of course I'm sure we would all like to thank the panelists for their insights and sharing their knowledge with us. Thank you.